Hi, welcome to Bernard's Essay Talk, and today's question is: militant action did more harm than good in attempting to advance the cause of women's suffrage in the years 1908 to 1914. I'm going to talk about this in 4 different parts. In the first part, I'll talk about who embraced militancy and why. In the second part, I'll talk about the escalation of that militancy. In the third part, I'll talk about militancy as harmful. And in the fourth and final part, I'll talk about militancy as helpful. And by way of conclusion, I'm going to argue that militancy had a very, very important place within the WSPU. However, because of suffragette violence, women missed an opportunity, a golden opportunity, to secure the vote in 1912 and therefore did more harm than good. So beginning with part 1, who embraced militancy and why? Although this question appears to ask about militancy in general, this is really a question about the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, for which, from its very, very beginning, deeds, and in particular militant deeds, were absolutely central. It's what separated it from the more moderate National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and it was not only its strategy, it was also the core of its identity. And I think this is very, very well expressed in the text of this plaque that you can see down there, which reads, "I would rather be a rebel than a slave." And the reason why the WSPU embraced this violence was essentially because of failure. The failure to secure the vote by peaceful methods associated with this good group of people from the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, so that by 1912, or in 1912, when one more in a long line of suffrage bills again failed, in the words of Votes for Women, which was the magazine for the suffragettes, this method to deal with women's suffrage is doomed, and we do not intend to rest until our grievances are addressed. And this turn to violence is fully endorsed by the leadership. Christabel Pankhurst declares an all-out sex war, and here is Emmeline declaring,
"For 50 years, we have laboured peacefully to secure the vote for women. We've been ridiculed, battered, and ignored. Be militant, each of you in your own way. Those of you who can break windows, break them. Those of you who can further attack the sacred idol of property, do so. I incite this meeting and all the women in Britain to rebellion."
I incite this meeting to rebellion indeed. Actually, that speech was made at the Royal Albert Hall. So this is strong stuff, and here in a letter to the members of the WSPU is something perhaps even stronger, declaring to be militant is a moral duty and a political necessity, a duty which every woman will owe to her own conscience, and if any woman refrains from militant protest, she will share the responsibility for the crime. Submission under such circumstances will itself be a crime. Okay, so that completes who embraced militancy and why they did so. Now let's turn to section 2, the escalation of that militancy. And this happened because once embraced, militancy carried its own logic to escalation, requiring governments either to concede to their demands or to intensify the conflict. And with successive governments unwilling to concede and increasingly looking to repression, suffragette militancy became progressively radicalised, which of course then in turn prompted still more repression. So that by 1912 it had escalated really to become a strategy of violence and bombs and arson, directed both to the men in government and also to private property. In terms of the men in government, Churchill was horsewhipped on the platform of Bristol Station. Asquith was attacked in his car in Downing Street and all the windows broken. The house being built for Lloyd George was blown up, and there were attempts to burn down cabinet ministers' homes and an attempt to set fire to a packed theatre in Dublin with Asquith inside. And there was even a plot to kidnap the Home Secretary to subject him to force feeding. And the bombs and the arson, well, those were of course directed to property, so that between 1913 and 1914 around 50 churches had been attacked. Houses and racecourse grandstands and sports pavilions and timber yards were all burnt down. There were bombs at railway stations, in post offices, in the banks, including the Bank of England, and artworks were damaged and slogans in acid were written on golf courses, votes for women. Telephone wires were cut, and there was a campaign of mass destruction of letters and letterboxes across the country. So in the light of all this, some speak of suffragette terrorism, using force and fear to effect change, and whose template of the bomb and the hunger strike would become, later in the century, the template for Irish nationalist terrorism. So that's how it escalated. Now let's move to the third section to see how that harmed the suffrage cause. Put simply, violent militancy, in the words of Bob Whitfield, alienated virtually all the allies on whom their success ultimately depended. It alienated moderates, it alienated sympathetic politicians from across the spectrum, it alienated political opinion, and it also alienated Democrats, who saw in suffragette violence a movement for democracy which itself shunned democracy. For Emmeline and Christabel, the kind of violent and illegal protest that they sought to pursue required, in their view, absolute control by a small group of dedicated and radical leaders, adopting a model that today would be understood as Leninist, another famous exponent of absolute control in the name of equality. And all of this undermined the image so carefully cultivated by the moderate suffragists of female responsibility. And it went on to generate hostility and prejudice and the usual demeaning stereotypes, portraying women generally and suffragettes in particular as unstable and fanatical and hysterical and irresponsible and far too reckless to be trusted with the vote. And there is a very powerful piece of evidence to substantiate this view, which centres upon the fate of something called the Conciliation Bill of 1912. Between 1910 and 1912, there were 3 attempts to produce women's suffrage bills. These were drawn up from a committee of sympathetic MPs from all parties, and that's why they were called conciliation bills, because they wanted to conciliate their differences over how to legislate for women's suffrage. And of all the attempts over the late 19th and early 20th century to secure the vote for women, it was the third of these conciliation bills that was easily the best opportunity. But this was sabotaged by suffragette violence and was defeated by 14 votes. And yet, the very same bill, the second conciliation bill, but the same in its content, passed just a year before with a majority of 167. And although it didn't become law then because of parliamentary procedure, the expectation is that this version would succeed. But against a spike in violent militancy, now 42 MPs who previously had voted for the second conciliation bill now voted against, and 91 who previously voted for it abstained. Okay, so that's the case then for how militancy harmed the suffrage cause. Now let's look at the fourth section to consider militancy as helpful. And here there are 2 lines of argument. Firstly, it's argued that good militancy needs to be separated out from bad militancy. And by good militancy, we mean early militancy, which was in its early phase very, very effective. beginning by refusing to be silent and transgressing male space, disrupting and heckling and asking awkward questions, breaking into public places such as the House of Commons, making speeches, chaining themselves to railings, and as government sought to repress these, then escalating to a deliberate strategy of seeking arrest, imprisonment and hunger strikes. And the effect of all of this was to absolutely revitalise the suffrage movement, generating publicity and attention, gaining sympathy and members and funds, and leading to an exponential growth in membership and organisation. So that by 1910, its income and staff exceeded that of the Labour Party, which sounds pretty much like success to me. And in addition to this, there is another argument for even violent militancy. And this argues that force is a component part of political success, which, if it were an equation, would read force plus persuasion equals success. And in their willingness to use force as well as persuasion to claim rights and resist tyranny, suffragettes can be seen as following in the tradition of English radicalism, which began with the Magna Carta when barons used force to claim rights against the king. It reappears in the English Civil War with Parliament using force again against the king. It continues with the Chartists, in this case the physical force Chartists, claiming rights against the Parliament, and it also played an important role in securing the 1832 and the 1867 Reform Acts. And here we see suffragettes speaking this language, speaking the language of rights against tyranny, which is the language that all of these protest movements had spoken in. So in all of this, it's possible to see moderate suffragists and radical suffragettes as essentially two wings of the same movement, with radicals blazing a trail, making the position of the moderates seem less extreme, and thereby bringing acceptance by society much more quickly. So to conclude, I think you can make a credible case to argue that militancy, and even violent militancy, was part of the English radical tradition, and that it also had a very important role within the cause of women's suffrage. More crucially, the non-violent militancy between 1908 and 1912 was clearly successful. However, the violent militancy between 1912 and 1914 is much more problematic, and the loss of the Third Conciliation Bill in 1912 can rightly be seen as a crucial moment of possibility that was sabotaged by this violence. And in this specific moment, it is true that militant action did more harm than good in advancing the cause of women's suffrage.